In this video lecture, we're going to talk about ethical relativism. In the previous chapter, we talked about the idea of ethical theory being used to deduce principles which we can use to justify ethical judgments. That is, we start with some view of what makes things right or wrong, and from that we can come up with rules, which we call principles, which can help us decide whether particular actions are right or wrong, either evaluating things that people have already done or making decisions about what we or someone else should do in the future. This kind of way of thinking about ethics, this idea of reasoning about ethics, presumes that there is some truth about ethics. The view known as ethical relativism, at least on some versions of it, throws this idea into question. It says, well, maybe there is no truth about ethics. Maybe there is no truth about right or wrong. Maybe ethics is just relative to a culture, that it's just whatever a culture has decided is right and wrong. Or maybe it's down to the individual, to the subjective level of what an individual thinks is right or wrong. So sometimes when people are having an argument about ethics, one person is saying that some particular policy is a good one, maybe building a wall on the southern border of the United States is a great idea, and someone else says, no, it's not a great idea, and they're arguing and giving reasons for why they think it's a good idea and the other side why they think it's a bad idea. And then some third party walks up and goes, hey, who's to say? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just somebody's opinion. This is a view of ethical relativism here, the who's to say response to ethical reasoning and ethical argument. There's actually two ways to think about ethical relativism. The descriptive version just says, well, there are differences between cultures. Some cultures think that women should cover their faces in public. Other cultures think that this is a bad idea and they shouldn't do it. And so we'd say, well, obviously these are differences in cultures, but all we're doing is describing a culture. This is a form of anthropology or sociology where we go around and say, well, look at all these differences. It's not saying there is no right or wrong between these cultures or that one thing is right or wrong. It's just saying, well, they have different opinions. And it's still an open question of whether there is some objective answer to whether things are right or wrong. And that's when we get into the normative version of ethical relativism, which says, no, there is no real right or wrong. If one culture thinks that women should have their faces covered, then that's right for them. And if another culture thinks that women shouldn't have their faces covered or be required to cover their faces in public, then that's right for them. And there's various things you could look at in these terms. A lot of people like to bring up the example of excision, also known as female genital mutilation or female circumcision. And somebody said, well, some cultures practice that and other cultures don't, but there's no right or wrong answer as to whether it's a good practice. Okay, that's a version of normative ethical relativism. It basically says, who's to say? Nobody in a sense is to say ultimately what is right or wrong. It's just down to the culture or even down to the individual. Of course, that takes us to this individual and cultural versions of ethical relativism. The cultural relativism, which may be the more common way of thinking about this, is that while one culture believes certain kinds of things are right, maybe they think that homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage is perfectly fine. Another culture thinks that it's not fine. And the culture itself determines what's right or wrong based on what we call their mores, their ethos of a culture. But there is no ultimate answer about which culture has the right answer to the particular question. Now, the individual version says that, well, what's true for me is not true for you when it comes to ethics. So it's not just, if I disagree with my culture, that's my opinion, and there's no right or wrong in terms of the opinion. And in a sense, then, ethics becomes sort of like aesthetics in the sense that, well, you like chocolate, I like vanilla. There's no right or wrong answer about which one's the better ice cream. It's just what I like. In terms of ethics, maybe I say that same-sex marriage is a good thing and you say it's a bad thing. There's no right answer to that question according to the individual relativist view, despite or irrespective of what our culture might say. Now, if we look at the text, pages 34 through 37, various reasons are given in support of ethical relativism, and some of these reasons sound pretty good. And so the text goes through these reasons and explains them. And one reason people give is they just look at different cultures and say, wow, cultures have different ethical views. You can look at contemporary cultures around the world, or you could look at history and say, well, back in 2,000 years ago in ancient Athens, they had different beliefs about what's right and wrong than we do now. Things like women's rights, for example, and other sorts of things. So, well, obviously, there's differences. So maybe this is a reason to think that, well, normative ethical relativism is true. Another reason given is this idea that we should be tolerant of other cultures. So this leads people to think, well, if we should be tolerant of different ethical views and not judge people, then there must be no reason to judge, that there's no reason to say that one's better than another. And so that's the only way to be tolerant, is to say, well, who's to say, in effect? Another reason given is this idea of moral uncertainty. Well, we can't be sure about the answer to certain ethical questions, whereas in the sciences, for example, we're often convinced that certain facts about chemistry or physics or biology are true, and we're pretty certain that these facts are true. Whereas in ethics, we're often left with, I think this is a really good reason to believe this, but I'm not sure. So that uncertainty may lead us to believe, well, there is no ultimate answer. And finally, what's mentioned here is situational differences, and just the idea that in a certain situation, what's right for one person in another situation may be not right for that same person or for a different person. And so leads us to believe, well, ethics must be a thing that just changes depending on the situation. Now, we can ask if these reasons are convincing, and the text goes through each one of these and offers counter arguments to each of these. I'm not going to rehearse them here. You can look at it yourself. Ultimately, what some people claim is that, well, even though there are a lot of differences among cultures, there's a lot of ways in which people agree. And there's a lot of virtues of character and actions that people consider morally good that are everywhere in all cultures throughout history. And that if we could start from those, we'd say, well, people are more alike in their ethical views than they are different. If you look at certain things like an unjustified killing of someone, like every culture says, well, that's a morally wrong thing to do, for example. And there's certain things that cultures value and individuals value, no matter who they are, or when they live, or where they live. So those can be seen as reasons to undermine ethical relativism. Now, as we move through the course, we'll see, we're going to look at theories where people say, well, there are reasons, good and bad, and better and worse reasons to support ethical views, even though maybe we can't be certain about some of the answers, and even though people will continue to disagree, we can still analyze the reasons behind it. But ethical relativism has been since the beginning of ethical philosophy, and it continues to be a major challenge to the project itself. And you may be someone who leans toward an ethical relativist view. And as we go through the course, you'll have to understand these other views and argue against them, although you may keep a relativistic or even a pluralistic view in the back of your mind, or you may not. You may reject it as the road towards moral nihilism, the idea that, well, nothing is right or wrong, so you can do whatever you want. So that ends our video lecture on ethical relativism.